The evening sun was slowly setting, and the warm glow of the sky filtered through the large glass windows of a busy restaurant in the city. People filled the place with laughter, conversations, and the clinking of glasses. Waiters moved quickly from one table to another, balancing trays, taking orders, and trying to keep everyone satisfied. It was the kind of evening where the restaurant seemed alive, full of energy and movement. Yet among all that noise and activity, one moment would soon change everything. The door opened slowly, and in walked an elderly black woman. Her steps were gentle, but there was a quiet strength in the way she carried herself. She wore a simple dress that was clean and neatly pressed, and her hair was carefully styled in soft curls. Though she looked tired from the long day, her face carried kindness and her eyes showed wisdom that only comes with age. She looked around the restaurant for an empty seat, hoping to enjoy a peaceful meal. For a brief second, no one paid much attention. People kept talking and laughing, and the waiters continued their rush from table to table. But as she stood there waiting, some customers noticed her presence. A few smiled politely while others looked away, busy with their own lives. The woman didn't mind. She had learned long ago not to expect much from strangers. All she wanted was a seat and a warm dinner. She moved slowly toward a small table near the corner, the kind of place where she could sit quietly and not disturb anyone. With her hands resting on the back of the chair, she sat down carefully, adjusting herself and placing her small handbag on her lap. For her, dining out was not something she did often. Most days she cooked at home, but tonight felt different. Tonight she wanted to treat herself to something nice, something simple that would make her heart happy. As she looked at the menu, her fingers ran over the pages, though her eyes paused at the prices. She wasn't a wealthy woman, but she had saved enough to enjoy a good meal. Her choice was modest, something filling but not too expensive. She waited patiently, expecting a waiter to approach as they had done for all the other tables. The people around her were already being served drinks, plates of hot food, and desserts. She sat quietly with hope in her eyes, believing her turn would come soon. Time passed slowly, and she noticed that waiters seemed to glance at her but then quickly turn away. Her heart sank a little, but she brushed the feeling aside. Maybe they were busy. Maybe they hadn't seen her. She folded her hands on the table and gave a gentle smile each time a waiter walked past, hoping to catch their attention. But no one stopped. She sighed softly, remembering the many times in her life she had been overlooked. She had faced moments like this before, moments when people judged her without knowing who she truly was. And though it always hurt, she had learned to carry herself with dignity. She told herself that patience was her strength, and she would not let bitterness show on her face. A family at a nearby table noticed her sitting alone. The children whispered questions to their parents, and the mother gave the elderly woman a kind smile. It was a small gesture, but it meant something. The woman returned the smile, grateful for the humanity in that simple exchange. Meanwhile, the restaurant continued to buzz with life. The sound of laughter grew louder as more people entered, and the smell of freshly cooked meals filled the air. The elderly woman inhaled the scent of warm bread, grilled meat, and seasoned vegetables. Her stomach tightened slightly with hunger, but she kept her posture straight and her expression calm. She had always been taught that true strength was shown not in loud words but in quiet patience. At that very moment, she thought of her son. He had grown into a remarkable man, someone she was proud of every single day. He often reminded her to take care of herself, to enjoy life, and not to let anyone make her feel small. It was partly his voice in her heart that gave her courage to sit there, waiting with dignity instead of walking out when she felt ignored. Minutes felt like hours, yet she didn't complain. She adjusted her handbag on her lap, smoothed the fabric of her dress, and continued to wait. She believed deep down that patience always reveals truth. And little did she know this quiet moment at a corner table was the beginning of something unforgettable. Something that would not only shake the waiter who refused to serve her, but also leave every person in that restaurant with a story they would never forget. Her presence, though calm and unspoken, carried weight. It was as if the air around her whispered of history, of struggles endured and of victories won in silence. She wasn't just a woman looking for dinner. She was a symbol of strength, resilience, and grace. And soon the world inside that restaurant would see exactly who she was and why appearances can never measure the true value of a person. The restaurant was alive with the rhythm of clattering dishes and the steady hum of conversation. But the elderly woman's corner table still sat untouched. A young waiter, perhaps in his early 20s, finally noticed her. His name tag caught the light as he walked briskly through the room, balancing a tray of drinks with practiced skill. He was sharp, quick on his feet, and seemed to take pride in his work. Yet when his eyes fell on the elderly woman, something changed in his expression. He paused for a second, frowning slightly, as though she didn't quite belong there. Maybe it was the way her dress wasn't as fashionable as the other guests, or perhaps it was the simple handbag clutched carefully on her lap. Whatever it was, a shadow of judgment crossed his face. Instead of stepping toward her table as he had done for every other guest, he deliberately turned away, heading instead to serve a younger couple who had arrived after her. The woman noticed. Her smile faltered, though only for a moment. She straightened her posture, reminding herself not to take things to heart too quickly. People could be busy, distracted, or simply unaware. Still, a quiet ache grew inside her chest. She had been ignored before, and she recognized the look in his eyes. Minutes passed, and the waiter finally circled back near her table. This time she raised her hand slightly, hoping to catch his attention. Their eyes met. For a brief moment she expected him to walk over with a smile, just as he had done with the other guests. Instead, his lips pressed into a thin line, and his step slowed as if he were reconsidering. Then with a cool tone that carried just enough sharpness to cut, he said, "I'm sorry, but we're very busy tonight. Maybe you should come back another time." His words were not shouted, but they were firm enough to sting. The elderly woman blinked, her hand lowering slowly back to her lap. She wasn't used to causing trouble, and she certainly wasn't the type to demand attention. Yet something about the way he said it, the dismissive wave of his hand, the lack of respect in his eyes, felt heavier than any words she had heard in years. She opened her mouth to respond, but the waiter had already turned away, pretending to tidy another table. To him, it was as if she didn't exist, as though she were invisible. A few nearby diners noticed the exchange. One man raised his eyebrows, whispering something to his wife, while another woman shook her head, clearly uncomfortable with what she had just witnessed. The restaurant, however, kept moving. Plates continued to arrive at tables, children laughed, glasses clinked together in toasts. But for the elderly woman, the world felt strangely still. She looked down at the menu, her eyes tracing the words she had already read a dozen times. Her hunger remained, but now it was tangled with something else, a deep sadness, one she had tried to bury long ago. Still, she refused to let bitterness take root. Instead, she folded her hands gently on the table and kept her gaze steady. If there was one lesson life had taught her, it was that dignity is not something anyone can take away. It is something you carry within yourself, no matter how others treat you. Meanwhile, the waiter carried on with his work, unaware that his decision to refuse her service would soon become the most unforgettable moment of his career. At other tables, he joked with customers, recommended dishes, and even flashed a charming smile. But each time he passed her corner, he avoided her eyes. Deep down, maybe he knew. Maybe some small voice inside him whispered that what he had done was wrong. But pride has a way of silencing conscience. The elderly woman sat quietly, her presence both soft and powerful. She didn't scold him, didn't raise her voice, didn't cause a scene. Her silence carried more weight than anger ever could. And though the waiter thought he had brushed her aside, he would soon learn that the story was far from over. Unbeknownst to him, her son was already on his way. With every tick of the clock, the distance between mother and son was closing, and with it the line between prejudice and truth. The waiter believed he had the final say, but destiny was about to prove him wrong in the most unexpected way. The rejection that seemed so simple to him, so easy to justify, was about to unravel into a moment of revelation that would leave the entire restaurant stunned. The restaurant was full of chatter, laughter, and the aroma of freshly cooked food. But at the corner table sat the elderly woman, alone and ignored. The waiter's refusal still echoed in her ears, but she did not let anger take control. Years of experience had taught her that life often tested one's patience, and dignity was not measured by how loudly you respond, but by how gracefully you rise above the insult. She adjusted the little handbag on her lap and drew in a deep breath. For a moment she closed her eyes and remembered all the times in her life when people had underestimated her. As a young girl, she had often been told she would never achieve much. As a young mother, she had faced countless struggles, fighting to provide for her family while people doubted her strength. Yet here she was, older, wiser, still standing tall. The waiter's dismissive words were just another test, another attempt by life to see if she would bend or break. Opening her eyes, she looked around. Every other table was alive with service. Waiters moved like dancers across the floor, carrying trays piled with food, filling glasses with water and smiling at customers as though they were royalty. Her table, however, remained bare. No glass, no bread, no plate, just the empty wooden surface staring back at her. But instead of bitterness, she chose calm. She straightened her back, placed her hands gently on the table, and let a soft smile rest on her face. She would not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her broken. Dignity, she believed, was her armor, and though her heart ached from the sting of rejection, her spirit remained unshaken. Some customers continued to glance at her. A mother with 2 young children whispered something to her husband and gave the woman a sympathetic smile. The elderly woman returned the smile with warmth, though her eyes told a story deeper than words could explain. She wasn't looking for pity. She only wanted to be treated as any other guest. Minutes passed and still no one came to her table. Hunger tugged gently at her stomach, but her patience was stronger. She reminded herself of the values she had passed down to her children: patience, respect, and self-worth. Her son had often told her, "Mama, never let anyone's small mind make you doubt your greatness." Those words echoed in her heart now, giving her quiet strength. Instead of focusing on the waiter's cruelty, she let her eyes wander to the world around her. She noticed the young couple laughing across the room, their hands brushing across the table as if they were the only 2 people alive. She saw a group of friends raising glasses in celebration, their joy filling the air. She even watched a little boy trying to balance a breadstick on his nose, making his parents laugh. Despite the sting of her own situation, she found joy in the small details of life happening around her. That was her gift, to find beauty in places where others only saw pain. To see light even when surrounded by shadows. The waiter passed by again, this time avoiding her gaze completely. She could have spoken up, could have demanded her right to be served, but instead she chose silence. Not the silence of weakness, but the silence of power, the kind that makes people wonder, what is she thinking? Why doesn't she react? She knew her worth didn't depend on a waiter's approval. She had lived long enough to understand that people often reveal more about themselves in how they treat others than in what they say. His refusal said nothing about her value. It said everything about his character. At that moment, she folded her hands in her lap and whispered a small prayer under her breath. Not a prayer for revenge or justice, but for strength. She asked for the patience to rise above, for the grace to forgive, and for the wisdom to let life handle the rest. The restaurant carried on as if nothing had happened, but her quiet dignity began to capture attention. More people started to notice the contrast. Every table bustling with service while one elderly woman sat untouched. Whispers spread, glances grew longer, and soon the waiter's behavior could no longer be ignored. Still, she remained composed. Her calm presence, her gentle smile, and her unshaken grace made her appear almost regal, as though she were someone far greater than anyone in that room could imagine. And indeed she was, for in just a short while her son would walk through that same door. And when he did, the truth of who she really was and the depth of the dignity she carried would leave every single person in that restaurant in stunned silence. The restaurant buzzed with life, yet something unusual began to stir among the guests. At first, no one paid much attention to the elderly woman in the corner. She seemed quiet, her presence gentle, almost invisible compared to the laughter and clinking glasses around her. But slowly, as time passed and plates piled high with food at every other table, whispers began to rise. People noticed. A young boy, no more than 10 years old, tugged at his mother's sleeve and pointed toward the corner. "Mom," he whispered, "why doesn't that lady have food?" His voice was innocent, filled with curiosity rather than judgment. The mother followed his gaze, her eyes softening as she saw the woman sitting alone, her table still bare. She gave her son a reassuring smile, though inside, she too wondered the same thing. At a nearby table, a group of coworkers paused in their laughter when they realized the woman had been sitting there for far too long without service. One of them frowned. "Strange," he murmured. "I swear she came in before us." His colleagues glanced over. and soon they too felt the quiet tension. The scene was subtle, but it was growing louder in the unspoken language of human observation. Every smile the woman gave, every calm movement of her hands resting gently on her lap, seemed to clash with the waiter's cold indifference. She wasn't demanding attention, yet the lack of it became louder with each passing minute. The waiter, busy and seemingly unaffected, passed her table more than once. But now he wasn't just ignoring her. He was doing it under watchful eyes. People saw the way his pace quickened as he passed, the way he avoided eye contact, the way he reserved his brightest smiles for others while offering her nothing but silence. At the far end of the restaurant, a couple on a date leaned closer together, whispering. The woman shook her head in disbelief. "It's not right," she muttered softly. Her partner nodded, his jaw tightening as if he too felt the sting of injustice on her behalf. The elderly woman, unaware of the full attention she was drawing, continued to sit with poise. She lifted her glass of water, one she had taken for herself from a nearby service counter when no one brought it, and sipped slowly. Her dignity, calm and unbroken, only deepened the impression she made on everyone watching. The whispers grew into small ripples of conversation. Some looked away quickly, not wanting to be involved. Others, however, kept glancing back, their expressions a mix of curiosity, discomfort, and even quiet anger at what they saw. It wasn't just about poor service anymore. It was about the feeling, clear and undeniable, that this woman had been singled out. A middle-aged man near the bar watched closely, his brow furrowed. He had been in restaurants all his life, but rarely had he seen such deliberate neglect. He shifted in his chair, torn between saying something and staying silent. His wife placed a hand on his arm, whispering, "Wait. Let's see what happens." Every pair of eyes in the room began to tell a silent story. Some were filled with sympathy, some with quiet judgment of the waiter, and others with the uncomfortable guilt of bystanders who knew something wrong was happening, but weren't sure how to respond. The elderly woman, however, remained unchanged. Her calmness, her ability to sit with quiet strength, made her seem almost untouchable. She wasn't loud, she wasn't angry, and yet she was commanding the room in a way no one could have expected. The waiter, still oblivious to the storm building around him, continued with his usual tasks. He laughed with one table, charmed another, and walked confidently between guests, believing he was in control. But the truth was shifting. The spotlight he thought was on him as a skilled waiter had turned, without his knowledge, to the woman he had tried to erase. She had become the center of the room not because she demanded it, but because her very existence in that moment was impossible to ignore. The tension spread like a quiet wave. Every clink of silverware seemed sharper, every burst of laughter felt out of place, as if the restaurant itself was beginning to sense the weight of the moment. And then, just when the whispers seemed ready to burst into words, the door opened again. A tall figure stepped inside, his presence commanding, his eyes searching the room. The elderly woman looked up, and for the first time that evening her face lit with relief. Her son had arrived. The onlookers didn't know who he was. Not yet. But they would soon learn, and the lesson they were about to witness would echo in their hearts long after the plates were cleared and the restaurant returned to its ordinary rhythm. The door of the restaurant swung open with a soft creak, and the cool night air slipped inside, mixing with the warmth of roasted food and chatter. Heads turned briefly, the way people always glance at new arrivals, then returned to their plates. But this time, the man who stepped in carried something different, an energy that seemed to shift the room without a single word spoken. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and well-dressed in a suit that spoke of quiet success rather than arrogance. His posture was straight, his step steady, and his eyes sharp as they scanned the restaurant. There was confidence in his presence, but not the kind that demanded attention. It was the kind that earned it naturally, the kind that comes from a life built on discipline, respect, and determination. He had come straight from work, his tie loosened only slightly, his briefcase still in hand. He looked like a man who carried responsibility on his shoulders every day and wore it with pride. But at that moment he wasn't there as a professional. He wasn't there as a leader or as someone admired in the community. He was there as a son. The elderly woman lifted her head the moment he stepped inside. Her eyes, which had held calm patience through the evening, now softened with relief. She smiled, a smile only a mother could give, one filled with love, pride, and the unspoken comfort of knowing her child had arrived. He noticed her instantly. No matter how many faces filled the restaurant, his gaze went straight to hers. The connection between them was unmistakable, invisible threads woven over decades of love and struggle pulling them together in that single moment. He walked across the floor with measured steps. Conversation slowed. A few onlookers who had been whispering about the ignored woman now followed him with curious eyes. The young boy at the corner table tugged at his mother's sleeve again, whispering, "Is that her son?" The mother didn't answer. She was just as curious as everyone else. The waiter, busy arranging plates at another table, hadn't yet noticed him. He moved with the same air of self-importance, convinced that his evening was running smoothly. But fate was walking closer with every step the son took. As the man approached his mother's table, he placed his briefcase gently on the empty chair beside her and bent down slightly. "Mama," he said softly, his voice carrying warmth and strength all at once. "I'm sorry I'm late." The elderly woman's eyes glistened. "It's all right, son," she replied quietly, her voice calm but carrying the weight of all she had endured in the last half hour. He straightened up and looked around. His eyes swept across the empty table, no water pitcher, no bread, no sign of service. It didn't take long for him to understand what had happened. His jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. He wasn't a man who lost control easily, but his silence alone carried power. Around them, customers watched closely. Something about his presence demanded attention. The man didn't shout or cause a scene. He didn't have to. His very demeanor, the way he stood beside his mother, protective yet composed, was enough to shift the atmosphere in the room. Finally, the waiter turned and noticed him. At first, his usual confidence didn't waver. But as he saw the man's sharp gaze fixed firmly on him, his steps faltered. The careless arrogance he had carried earlier began to melt away. He realized, perhaps too late, that the situation had changed. The son pulled out the chair and sat across from his mother. He reached for her hand and held it gently, the kind of gesture that spoke more than words ever could. In that moment, it wasn't just a mother and son sharing a table. It was history, love, and resilience embodied in two people who had walked through life's storms together. The whispers in the restaurant grew louder now. People leaned closer to one another, curious to know who this man was. Some guessed he might be an important figure, others thought he looked familiar, and a few simply sensed that something profound was about to happen. The elderly woman, with her quiet grace, didn't say much. But her smile widened, not because of pride in her son's success, but because he had come for her. He had arrived, and with him, she was no longer alone at that bare corner table. The waiter stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. Should he step forward? Should he apologize? Should he continue pretending nothing was wrong? Every option felt dangerous now, because the truth was standing tall in front of him, and the truth had eyes that saw straight through arrogance. The son finally turned fully toward the waiter, his expression calm but firm. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of both authority and restraint. It wasn't loud, but it was strong enough that the nearest tables could hear. "Excuse me," he said. "Is there a reason my mother has been sitting here for nearly half an hour without being served?" The room grew silent. Forks paused mid-air, conversations died, and all attention fell on the confrontation about to unfold. The waiter swallowed hard, suddenly wishing he had chosen differently when the elderly woman first walked in. The son's presence had changed everything. And soon, everyone in that restaurant would discover exactly who he was, and why refusing to serve his mother had been the biggest mistake of the waiter's life. The room seemed to hold its breath. Every table, every chair, every whisper had gone silent after the son's calm but pointed question. The waiter froze in place, his mouth opening and closing like a man searching for an excuse that would not come. His confidence, once so strong, now flickered like a candle in the wind. The son's eyes never left him. They were sharp, steady, and impossible to escape. Though his voice had been calm, the weight of his words echoed across the restaurant. "Is there a reason my mother has been ignored?" He repeated, softer this time, but even more powerful. The elderly woman sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed. She did not need to speak. Her son had taken up her cause. Yet the grace in her silence made her appear stronger than anyone else in that room. She had suffered the insult, but she left the response in the hands of the man she had raised. Finally, the waiter stammered, I didn't realize. But his words trailed off. His face flushed red, his earlier arrogance gone. He looked around, hoping to find an ally in the crowd, but instead found dozens of eyes fixed on him, judging, questioning. He stood alone. The son leaned back in his chair, never breaking eye contact. Didn't realize what? He asked evenly. The calm in his tone was more frightening than any shout could have been. The waiter swallowed hard. I thought she might just be waiting for someone. I didn't want to bother her. His excuse was thin, and everyone in the room knew it. A ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd. The son let the silence linger. He glanced at his mother, who gave him the smallest nod as if encouraging him to stay composed. Then he turned back to the waiter. You see this woman? He said, his hand gesturing toward his mother. His voice carried now, not loud but steady and strong enough for everyone in the restaurant to hear. This is not just my mother. This is a woman who has lived her life with dignity and grace. A woman who has sacrificed everything to raise her children. A woman who has given more to her community than you could ever imagine. The waiter blinked, unsure of how to respond. But the son wasn't finished. You dismissed her, he continued, his words deliberate. You looked at her dress, at her age, at her skin, and you decided she was not worth your time. You judged her before you even spoke to her. But do you know who she is? The room leaned in as though hanging on his every word. This woman, he said, placing his hand gently over his mother's, is the reason I stand here today. Everything I have, every success, every accomplishment, came from her sacrifices. And if you must know, yes, I am Dr. Jonathan Williams. A wave of gasps rippled through the restaurant. Several diners exchanged wide-eyed glances. Some whispered his name, recognizing him at once. Others looked at each other with surprise, realizing they were in the presence of someone well-known and deeply respected. The waiter's face went pale. He knew the name. Everyone in the city knew it. Dr. Jonathan Williams wasn't just another man in a suit. He was a renowned surgeon, a community leader, a man who had been featured in newspapers for his charity work and his relentless dedication to helping those in need. The irony was heavy. The very woman the waiter had refused to serve was the mother of a man admired by thousands, a man whose name carried weight far beyond the walls of this restaurant. The son's voice softened then, but it carried even more power. My mother deserves respect, whether she is sitting here alone in a simple dress or whether she walks in with me by her side. Her worth does not come from my name, my position, or what anyone else thinks of her. Her worth has always been her own. The elderly woman's eyes glistened with quiet pride. She had raised her son to be strong, but also to be kind. And now, seeing him defend her with such dignity, she felt the years of sacrifice were worth every struggle. The restaurant remained silent, heavy with the weight of the revelation. The waiter stood rooted to the floor, unable to meet the woman's eyes. His earlier arrogance burned away by shame, and then the son finished with words that would linger in every heart present. Remember this, he said, his voice like steel wrapped in velvet. You never know who you are serving. You never know the story of the person sitting before you. So serve everyone with respect, because respect is not about who they are, but about who you are. The message hung in the air, undeniable and unforgettable. The revelation was complete, not just of his identity, but of a truth that reached far deeper. The waiter stood frozen, as if the ground beneath him had turned to stone. Only minutes ago he had carried himself with confidence, weaving through tables with the ease of someone who believed he owned the room. Now that confidence had shattered like fragile glass. His hands trembled, his throat tightened, and his face turned pale. The name still echoed in his ears, Dr. Jonathan Williams. It rang like a bell that couldn't be silenced. Everyone knew that name. Even he in his quiet corner of the city had heard it. Dr. Williams was more than a respected surgeon. He was a voice for the community, a man whose reputation stretched beyond hospital walls. He had been on the news and magazines, celebrated for his brilliance and his heart. And this man, this symbol of achievement, had just declared that the woman the waiter dismissed so casually was his mother. A wave of shame crashed over him. His chest felt heavy, his thoughts scrambled. How could he have been so blind? How could he have let arrogance guide him instead of compassion? He looked at the elderly woman, still sitting with calm dignity, her hands folded neatly on the table. She hadn't lashed out. She hadn't demanded respect. She had let her son's presence reveal the truth, and now her quiet grace made his behavior feel even more disgraceful. The whispers around the room grew louder. Guests shook their heads, some in disbelief, others in disgust. A few stared directly at the waiter, their expressions sharp as if they too were demanding answers. The weight of their judgment pressed down on him until he felt smaller and smaller. The waiter tried to speak, but his voice cracked. I didn't mean. He stopped. The excuse sounded hollow even in his own ears. What could he say? That he was busy? That he hadn't noticed her? None of it would undo the truth. He had judged her, and he had done it cruelly. His knees felt weak, and for the first time in his career he wished he could disappear into the shadows of the restaurant. Every step he had taken earlier with arrogance now replayed in his mind like sharp daggers. He remembered ignoring her hand when she tried to signal him. He remembered the tone of his voice when he told her to come back another time. Each memory stung more deeply than the last. Finally, he forced himself to approach the table. His steps were slow, heavy, as though each one carried the weight of his mistake. When he reached them, his voice was barely more than a whisper. "Ma'am, sir, I am so sorry." The son looked at him steadily, his expression unreadable. The waiter's eyes darted nervously to the elderly woman, who returned his gaze with the same calm expression she had carried all evening. There was no anger in her eyes, only something far more difficult to face. Disappointment. The waiter's throat burned. He wished she would yell, scold, or throw back sharp words. That would have been easier. But her silence, her gentle patience made his guilt unbearable. "I didn't realize who you were," he stammered again, trying to grasp at words that would make sense. But the son leaned forward slightly, his voice firm. "And that," Dr. Williams said, "is the problem. You shouldn't need to know who she is to treat her with respect." The waiter's heart sank even deeper. There was no escaping the truth of those words. Respect should not depend on status, wealth, or reputation. It should be given freely, simply because every human being deserves it, and yet he had failed in the most basic way. His hands twisted nervously in front of him. "Please," he said, his voice cracking. "Forgive me. I made a mistake. I don't know what I was thinking." The elderly woman finally spoke, her voice soft but steady. "You were thinking only of yourself," she said gently. "But life will teach you, sometimes in painful ways, that every person who sits before you has a story you cannot see. That is why kindness should always be your first choice." The waiter's eyes burned with unshed tears. He nodded quickly, ashamed, his head bowing lower and lower. He had never felt so small in his life. Around the restaurant, the silence was heavy, broken only by the faint clinking of cutlery. The lesson was not just for him, it was for everyone. The entire room had witnessed the ugliness of prejudice and the beauty of grace, all in a single evening. The waiter stood there for a long moment, not sure if he should leave, speak again, or simply vanish. His apology had been spoken, but deep down, he knew forgiveness was not something that came with words, it had to be earned, and he wasn't sure he ever could. He turned away slowly, carrying the weight of regret that would stay with him for a long time. Each step felt heavier, each breath more difficult. He knew the night had changed him forever, and though shame burned his soul, a tiny part of him understood. Perhaps this painful moment was the very lesson he needed to learn. The restaurant was still, as if time itself had paused to listen. The tension of the moment lingered in the air, heavy and unforgettable. Every person in the room had witnessed the scene unfold, and though no one spoke, they all felt it, the weight of truth pressing gently but firmly into their hearts. The elderly woman sat gracefully, her hands resting in her lap, her eyes calm and steady. She had said little, but her silence spoke louder than the waiter's excuses or the whispers of the crowd. She was not a woman seeking revenge, nor was she looking for recognition. Her quiet dignity had carried her through the insult, and now it carried her through the aftermath. Her son, Dr. Jonathan Williams, still sat beside her, his hand resting protectively over hers. His words had cut through the air like a blade, leaving behind a truth that no one could ignore. Respect is not earned by titles or wealth, but deserved simply by being human. The waiter stood near the edge of the room, head bowed, his face pale. He had offered an apology, but his shame was far from gone. The lesson had already begun to etch itself into his heart. deeper than any reprimand could have done. He knew that what had happened tonight would not be easily forgotten, not by him, not by anyone. At another table, the young boy who had first noticed the ignored woman tugged at his mother's sleeve again. "Mom," he whispered, "she's really important, isn't she?" The mother looked at him thoughtfully, her eyes softening as she glanced toward the elderly woman. "Yes," she replied quietly, "but not because of her son. She's important because she's a person, and every person matters." Those words settled into the boy's heart, planting seeds that would grow with him for the rest of his life. All around, people shifted in their seats, reflecting. Some bowed their heads in quiet guilt, knowing they too had once judged someone too quickly. Others felt inspired, reminded to treat others with kindness regardless of status or appearance. The lesson was not only for the waiter, it was for everyone. The elderly woman finally lifted her head and looked at her son. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice full of warmth. "But you didn't have to say anything. I've faced worse in my life. This was only another test." Her son smiled gently, his eyes shining with respect. "Mama, you may be used to tests, but that doesn't mean you should face them alone. Tonight the world needed to see who you are, and maybe, just maybe, someone needed to learn what dignity looks like." Her smile deepened, not out of pride for herself, but for the man her son had become. She had raised him with values of respect and kindness, and now he was passing those same values back to the world. The waiter stepped forward one last time, his voice trembling. "Ma'am, Dr. Williams, I know my apology isn't enough, but I will not forget this. I promise I will never make the same mistake again." The elderly woman studied him quietly. Her gaze was not harsh, but it was piercing, the kind of look that could reach straight into a soul. Finally, she nodded gently. "I forgive you," she said, her words soft but firm. "But forgiveness does not erase the lesson. Carry it with you, and let it change the way you see others. That will be enough." Tears welled in the waiter's eyes. He bowed his head deeply, humbled in a way he had never been before. The restaurant seemed to exhale then, the heavy silence breaking into a new kind of stillness. One filled not with tension, but with reflection. People returned to their meals, but the atmosphere had changed. Every glance, every smile carried a little more kindness, a little more awareness. As the night moved on, the elderly woman and her son finally received their meal. It wasn't just food on a plate, it was a symbol of something greater. A reminder that dignity cannot be denied, that respect is not optional, and that sometimes the simplest encounters hold the most powerful lessons. When they finished their dinner and stood to leave, every pair of eyes followed them. Some diners nodded respectfully, others smiled with admiration, and as the door closed softly behind them, the room seemed quieter, more thoughtful than before. For the waiter, the lesson had carved itself into his heart. He knew he would never again look at a guest the same way. For the onlookers, the story would travel home with them, retold at dinner tables and whispered into young ears as a lesson in kindness. And for the elderly woman and her son, it was simply another reminder of the truth they had always known. Respect all. Judge none. Treat every soul with dignity. The world may often forget this lesson, but on that night in that restaurant it was written into every heart that had witnessed it.